go. Okay, today we're at the Yoakum, Texas wastewater treatment plant in South Texas. Our objective here today is we're going to totally disassemble the Clarifier drive, and we're going to leave the Clarifier in service when we do this. A couple of things I want to say about the Clarifier before we get started. This particular Clarifier is a rapid sludge removal style Clarifier. It's our design. In our rapid sludge removal style Clarifier, we use troughs up at the surface instead of having a manifold beneath the water that you can't see what's going on. We bring that manifold to the surface so you can see the flow coming up through the suction tubes off the floor. Now, before I'm going to do the work on this Clarifier drive, there's a couple of things we're going to do. Number one, we're going to check the sludge depth in the Clarifier to see what kind of a sludge blanket we've got. And when we finish the project, we're going to check the sludge blanket again to see how much it grew. Because during the disassembly process and the reassembly process, we are going to shut down the RES pumps. A couple of reasons. Number one, after the arm's set in one place for a while, we won't be sucking anything but clear water anyway. But number two, when this trough is running at a fairly high RES rate, the water level in the trough may be as much as 6 or 8 inches lower than the water surface in the Clarifier. Therefore, we've got a certain buoyant factor on that, and we do not want this Clarifier with upward pressure while we're trying to do the work on this gear disassembly. We want all of our forces or all of our weight down. Okay? The other thing we're going to do is we are going to get the arms of this Clarifier perpendicular to the bridge, primarily because we're going to be handling some pretty heavy things out on the platform out here. We're going to be setting them to one side or the other, and we do not want this thing to shift one way or the other. By having the arms perpendicular to the bridge, this thing could not tilt but so much before the arm would stop it. Now it will not ever tilt, but it's just a safety factor. It's something that you want to do, just an extra safety precaution. Okay, before we get started on this project, I want to go over all the items that you're going to need to do this total disassembly and reassembly process. First off, you're going to need a hoist to do the work with. This is a hoist that has up to a 2-ton capability or to a half-ton capability, depending on what kind of cantilever you're using out here. This is a sufficient size crane to do all the work necessary to totally rebuild this drive. The other thing is we're going to, as we move stuff out of the gear or disassemble the gear, we're going to need to move the stuff over to the side to get it out of our way. So you need rollers on your crane so you can move from side to side. In this particular bridge, all the bridge is covered with grading, and so we've put down some wood to enable our crane to move from side to side more easily. Next thing we're going to go through is all of the other bits and pieces that you're going to need in the operation. First off, you're going to need a bucket. You're going to need a hose because you're going to want to drain all of the gear out of the Clarifier drive before you start this thing, or while you're starting to work, you can let it drain. And then of course you'll need oil to refill it when you get finished. First thing that we're going to have to take off on this mechanism is this unit right here, which is the primary and intermediate drive. And we're going to have something to set it on because it has a bottom shaft coming out and the pinion on it. So we brought us something that will serve as a aid to hold up this thing while we're doing the other work on it. We need some chains, some lifting ropes. For reassembly, we'll need a torque wrench to reset the torque. We've got an adjustable wrench, we need 4 jack bolts. Those are the first jack bolts you'll start your disassembly process with. Those jack bolts are 1 inch in diameter. We've welded a nut on the top, and we've got some other nuts that we're going to use so these things can be used as a jack bolt. We've got some clevises that we can hook up to our lifting ropes or chains. We've got some eye bolts that'll ease the process of trying to get a hold of some of these flat plates that are inside the drive. The size wrenches that you're going to need for all of the operations, you're going to need an 1.5 inch wrench to handle these 1 inch bolts. You're going to need a 1 1/8 inch wrench for some of the bolt heads inside the drive, and you're going to need a 15/16 inside. We recommend getting both open end and sockets to do this operation. When you get into the reassembly process, you're going to need an RTV sealant because we're going to reseal the drive as we come back out in order to keep as little water out of it as we can. Okay? Now what we've done is we've removed the grating over the top of the gear that we're going to replace. We put our 4 jack bolts in. You'll notice that we've rotated the clarifier mechanism to where these triangular sections of the rotating part of the drive are directly under these jack bolts. Now we've spun the jack bolts down. We have a nut on the bottom underneath this channel. In a minute we're going to hold that nut. We're going to take about a 1/4 turn on all of these bolts, and then we're going to have basically the weight of the bridge shifted from these members here to this location here. That will allow us to remove these members. Okay, right now is we've installed our jack bolts. We've got a nut on the bottom of this channel, a nut on the top of this channel. We backed up here. We took about 1 full turn, maybe a 1.5 turns at the most on each one of these bolts. And then we tightened this bolt down on the top, so we got our jack bolt locked in place. And the bridge, the weight of the bridge is resting now on the perimeter of the drive, where before the weight of the bridge was resting on these channels, which were mounted over the top of the drive, the center of the drive that does not normally rotate. So we're at the point now where we're fixing to pull this intermediate and primary unit off. Okay, remove this drive and do it without having to take all the wiring loose from these 2 conduit boxes, which go back over these junction boxes. I'm going to do it this way. First, I've got to take this bolt out. It holds the 2 torque overload springs in place. Then there's on the top of this shaft here, there's a cover. When you remove that cover, there's a bolt. You remove that bolt, and then this unit will lift off. Now, if it's been on for a number of years or a good period of time, it's probably going to have some rust in there. So you're probably going to have to work with it a little bit to get the rust broken. But once it breaks, then it'll come on off. One word of caution, when you're taking this unit off, when you pull it up, there are some spacers inside. You want to keep your hand underneath the box, have somebody pull it off while you keep your hand underneath. Remove all those spacers. Don't let them fall in the tank. There'll be probably 4 or 5 washers, and then 1 spacer that's the size of a washer, only it's about that long. It's diameter, got a hole in it like a washer, but it's a spacer, and it's about 1 inch or 1.5 inches long. You want to take them out and put them in the box. Once you get to that point, this unit will lift off. This plate that I'm moving here has 4 bolts on it. You take those 4 bolts out. Once those 4 bolts are out, then this unit and this unit can be moved over, set aside. We may tie it up here to the handrail to get it out of the way. Then the next step is to take off the intermediate drive. Okay. Again, we removed the primary drive with the overload. You can see we tied it off out of the way. You want to be very careful. You want to make sure you got it tied very well. You'd hate for it to drop. Next thing we did is we took all the bolts off, or the nuts off down here, and we pulled the intermediate drive. Okay? Now, the intermediate drive, the pinion slides on this shaft, and it's not an interference fit, but it is a close tolerance fit. So as you pull it out, the pinion's probably going to come with it. But the last thing you'd want to happen to you is to get this thing up here, the pinion fall off and fall into the tank. So while it's still down here and you still got something to catch the pinion with, you want to take something and pry. Don't take it, you won't have to pry it very much. That pinion will come on off, and that way you can leave it down in here. It's not going to fall in the tank. Once we get to this point, we're just going to jack it on up to get it a little bit higher. And we're going to roll it over to the side, and we're going to set it in our cradle that we brought. Then we'll be back on top, and we'll start taking the lid off the Clarifier drive. Okay, we've got the primary and the intermediate producer removed and out of the way. What we're doing now is we're taking the bolts that hold the cover to the Clarifier drive down. 4 of the bolts came out when we took the support members off where the bridge rests during normal operation. That leaves 5 other bolts. There's 3 flathead bolts that are beneath the intermediate drive, and then there's 2 more bolts on the outside out here. One of these happens to be a lifting eye that was used when the gear was delivered. So we're going to take out these 2 bolts, those 3 bolts, and when we get to that point, we'll be ready to pull the cover off of the drive. Now, what we've done, and something I didn't mention earlier on our tools that we needed to do this with, you need a little jack or some way to lift this cover plate up high enough to put a couple of eye bolts in so you can lift this plate on up. Now, these are not tapped holes, so you need an eye bolt that'll go through this hole, and then a nut to back it up on the bottom. We're going to put a couple in here, we're going to put a chain through them, and then we're going to lift this plate on up. But you need some method of raising this up high enough and holding it till you can get those eye bolts in there. Okay, when we got on with the chain, we picked this plate up one side. We came up between the 2 forks on the engine hoist, and you have to work with it a little bit, but we got it standing up straight. Up, over the other side of the fork, set it down on the grating, got it up against the handrail. We're going to take a piece of rope, we're going to tie it off so it can't roll or slip or fall down. So the next thing we've got to do now is take out the torque ring. Okay? Okay, the next process is to remove the torque transfer ring. So the first thing I'm going to do when I remove the torque transfer ring is I'm going to take out 4 bolts, and I'm going to take them out 90 degrees to each other so they're equally spaced, the 4 bolts. When I get those 4 bolts out, that's before I loosen anything else. Then I'm going to put this set screw in this hole. This one. At the end of the day, all 4 of these are going to get a set screw in them. set screw is going to be tightened down until it bottoms out. Once it bottoms out, then this rotating ring is resting on the outside flange of this casting. You got a flange here, and there's another flange right beneath those bolts. So when I put those set screws in there, that bottoms out, and it gets everything resting on top of this bottom casting. When I've got all my weight on this bottom casting, then I can go ahead and remove the rest of the bolts, and then take the inside bolts out, and then I can pull this torque transfer ring off. Okay. Okay, we have all the bolts out on the outer circle. As you can see, I've got a set screw here, set screw here, set screw here, and a set screw here. All of them equally spaced. So I've got now a total of 8 jack bolts. I've got these 4 jack bolts holding the bridge up. I've got these 4 jack bolts actually holding the mechanism up off the floor. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take out this inner bolt circle, and once I get that bolt circle out, then I can lift this ring off. Okay, ready to go. Okay, when you get the inside ring of bolts out, there's a little bit of space between this plate and the rotating plate down there. Enough space to get a screwdriver under, to crack it up a little bit, and then you get a pry bar under there, lift it up, put you a block under here, you can set it down. We're going to do the same thing we did with this. We're going to have to put a couple of eye bolts in here to get a hold of it with a chain to lift it up and get it out of the way. Okay? Okay, we've got all the bolts out now, and we've jacked the thing up like we talked about. We've got our chain on it now. We're going to do the same thing that's with this plate that we did with this plate. And that is, we're going to get the forks over to one side. When we pick the plate up, we're going to pick it up between the forks, lift it on up, and then out of the way and over on the side. Okay, that's good. Okay, we pull the ring up like we talked about. We started on that side. We fished it up between the 2 legs of the hoist all the way up. Set it over here on the outside of our platform. We tied it off so it won't fall down and hurt anybody. The last step is to remove the gear and the bearing. So what you're looking at in the clarifier right now is one set of bolts. That bolt circle holds the stationary part of the bearing down. That part of the bearing does not rotate. It stays in the same place all the time. This part of the gear is the rotating part of the bearing. That's what rotates. It's pushed by this pinion. When we take this set of bolts out here, we'll take a couple of more eye bolts. We'll put them in the holes. We'll do the same thing again. We'll move the hoist back over to the side. We'll fish this gear out the same way. Probably what we'll have to do first is we'll have to lift this gear straight up first and get it above this lip right here. We'll block underneath it, and then once we get it to that point, then we'll move over and we'll get a hold to one side. We'll fish it up between the legs, and then we can get it, once we get it up on the bridge, you can just roll it right down the bridge, roll your new bearing down, and reverse the procedure. The only other thing that might be a concern to you at some point in time, you remember we talked about this earlier, we bumped this pinion off the shaft of the intermediate reducer so we wouldn't accidentally drop it into the tank. But underneath this pinion there is another bearing. Okay, we're looking down into the pinion housing, you've got a bearing, a roller bearing down here in the bottom. If that keeps the pinion from moving in that direction, keeps it perfectly straight up and down all the time to keep total tooth engagement all the time while the gear is in operation. But this bearing, after many years of service, and especially if your condensate is not taken care of, then this bearing could go bad. And if it does, you're at a point now where you can fish this bearing out. This bearing could be fished out without doing all of this other operation that we went through. All you'd have to do is actually move this unit here, pull this up, and then you could fish this bearing out with the top and everything still on the bearing. But if the large bearing goes out, or a gear failure, or the large bearing locks up, then this is the procedure that we're going to go through to remove this bearing. Okay, we're hooked up to the bearing and the gear now. The last step will be to take that outer bolt circle out, remove the bolts. Once those bolts are removed, we'll raise this gear up above this lip. We'll put some blocks underneath it to make it stationary. Then we will move the two eye bolts over to one side. We'll roll the engine hoist over one direction or the other, and we'll repeat the process of pulling the gear up between the legs, just like we did these two parts. When we get it up, we'll move it over. We can set the bearing down. We'll move this out of the way. At that point in time, we can roll the bearing back off the bridge, roll the new bearing in place, reverse the procedure, put the new bearing in, put the torque plates back on, the covers back on, the intermediate reducer back on, and it's ready to turn back on and go back into operation. As you can see, we've been down several hours with the RAS pumps off, but the clarifier still been operating. Still got the clear effluent going. By the time we get this back on and get it back on, we may run our RAS pumps up to 100 or more until we get our sludge blanket drawn back down to where we want it to, and then we're back into normal operation. As you can see, we've done all this well inside of a work day. As long as you can get this done in that period of time, you generally don't have to worry about denitrification starting before 7 or 8 or 9 hours before you'll start seeing any denitrification. So again, we'll be totally back in operation again without having to take our clarifier out of service. We've got our new bearing back in place. We've got it bolted down. We want to set our pinion. We've got a keyway in our pinion here. That keyway's got to line up with our key that's in the shaft, the bottom shaft of our intermediate reducer. However, getting this keyway in a perfect position after we put a new bearing in, because our teeth may not have been in exactly the same place, that could be a little bit of a trick. Now, one reason that we removed all of this from the top of the intermediate reducer, I'm talking about the primary reducer and the overload device, one of the reasons we did that is when we swing this back over and lower it back down, I'll be able to move the key or turn this bottom shaft with my hand up here and get it perfectly aligned so I can set it on down into my pinion, match up with all my bolt holes on top. If I had all this mess back up on top, I'd have a problem doing that because I wouldn't be able to turn that without wiring it back up and turning it electrically. So that's one of the reasons for taking all this off in the first place. Okay. One thing I failed to mention when a while ago was when we got our gear back in, we replaced these bolts. We torqued all of these bolts to 125 foot-pounds with our torque wrench. When we put our torque transfer plate back on and we bolt our torque transfer plate to the bearing and to the rotating mechanism, again, we'll apply 125 foot-pounds of torque to all the bolts in this. Okay? Okay, one thing I failed to mention a while ago, but I want to bring it up now, is when you replace these bolts, the bolt holes that they go in are tapped, and those bolt holes are drilled through the bottom of the casting. So these bolts need to have RTV put on them before they're screwed in. Now RTV will make the seal and prevent the oil from leaking out of the bottom of the gear. Okay, we put the torque transfer ring back in. We haven't torqued it down yet, but I want to tell you the procedure that we used. We picked it off, we slid it down between the legs, over and back down, and between the legs of the hoist. We set it on a couple of wooden blocks. Then we took our eye bolts, we put one eye bolt on that side, we put one eye bolt on this side. We jacked it up where it came up kind of flat against the bottom of the hoist here. At that time, we took a regular caulking gun with RTV, and we put a bead of caulk underneath the outside bolts, actually to the outside of this outside bolt hole, all the way around. We got that in place. Then we lowered this torque transfer ring down over the bolt holes, set it down on there. You can actually see the RTV where it's kind of oozed out underneath the side of the flange there. Got all of our bolt holes lined up, and then we put all of our bolts back in, and I've snugged them down, but we haven't torqued them yet. So you can see I have them all in place with the exception of these four. Those four are the second set of jack bolts that we used. When I get all these torqued down to the right torque, then I'll take those jack bolts out. I'll put the last four in and I'll torque them down. Okay, what we're doing now is we pick the cover plate up, we set it over in between the legs of the hoist. We're letting it down. As we let it down, we're trying to move the hoist over a little bit at a time. Okay. Okay, we got it back down in the hole. We're going to set it down on the top of the drive. And we're going to get underneath it. We're going to recenter our hoist. We're going to pick it back up. So when we get it back up, then we can put a bead of caulking to seal the two housings together. And then we'll let it back down and we'll put the rest of the bolts in. Okay? Okay, again, like we did the torque transfer plate, we're doing the top in the same way. We fixed it down in between. We set it down. We put a block underneath the middle of it so we could pick it back up against the bottom of the hoist frame. Now we're putting a bead of caulking, RTV, around where this flange is going to sit down on top of the drive. This is to prevent condensate and rainwater and wash water from getting inside the gear and watering down the oil. Okay, as we were lowering the cover plate down, we used a couple of spud wrenches to line the hose up, so as we dropped it on down, we would land on top of our RTV and not mess it up too bad, so and try to get our bolt holes lined up. Now we're ready to go ahead and put the bolts in. Okay, we've gotten back a hold of our intermediate drive. We've lifted it up, moved our supports out of the way. We've moved it back over the top of the pinion. We're putting a bead of RTV down to make the seal, so when we set this intermediate drive down, it'll seal up. Next thing we'll do is we'll just back it up or pull it this way a little bit, center it over that pinion, and drop it in. We'll fiddle with it a little bit till we get our key lined up, and then we'll let it on down. Okay, we went ahead and stabbed our intermediate drive, messed with our shaft here, got our keyway lined up, let it sit on down on the bolts. Right before we dropped it on down, we put another bead of RTV down before we drop the gear down in place. Now we got the gear in place, we're going to tighten up those 4 bolts. And in a minute we'll be putting our primary and overload control back in place. You can see that we've tilted our crane up out of the way now. We're basically finished with the crane. We're ready to pretty much disassemble it and take it back and put it in the truck. Okay, we put our torque overload plate on top of our RF unit, our intermediate drive, bolted it down with 4 bolts. Then we set our primary reducer back down on top. We got our keyway lined up, worked it down, put our 2 springs in for our overload, our long bolt. We pushed it back through the springs, got it all the way through from side to side. We've tightened it up now. We've got this all the way down. The bolt tightened back up to hold it in place. We put the cap back on. We're ready now to put these 2 channels back in. When we get those 2 channels back in and bolted into place, then we'll be ready to take our first set of jack bolts out. When we take those jack bolts out, at that point in time, we'll be ready to turn the mechanism back on. Okay, now we've replaced the supports for the bridge in their normal mounting place. We tightened the bolts up. We were putting a little bit of RTV in the bolt holes of these bolts that are going to hold it down. But before we can tighten the bolts, tighten the ones on all 4 ends, but before we can tighten these down, we're going to have to let our jack bolts back down and set the weight of the bridge back down on the top of the middle of the drive. When we get that done, then we'll be ready to put oil in the drive and turn the mechanism back on. Okay. Taking the last jack bolt out, I think. Already removed the other 3, so when we took the last one out, the rest of the weight of the bridge set down on top of the drive here. We'll go ahead and tighten up these. The glass is tightening up now, and we'll be ready to put the oil in and turn it back on, put the grating back in place. Got all our bolts back in, and we're putting the oil back in it now. going to fill it up to the marked place on the side glass, which will be the proper oil level for it. As soon as we get that done, we'll put the plug back in and we'll be ready to go. The approximate quantity of oil that this lower housing holds is in the neighborhood of 3 gallons, approximately 3 gallons. Okay, we got our oil filled up. We put it to the level that we wanted on the side glass. Turn the airlift pump back on, or the RAS return pump back on. The troughs are starting to pull the sludge up off the floor again. Everything's pretty much back to normal now. I may kick the RAS pumps back up to a little bit higher, get the troughs washed out good, get the system scoured out, and we'll cut the RAS pump back to the level that we had it at and we wanted it at. Okay. Okay, we're pretty much done with the operation. We got the clarifier back operating again. We got the airlift pump turned up, or the RAS return pumps turned up a little bit high. You can see that we're pumping the troughs down quite a bit. I haven't turned the scum pump on to empty the scum troughs on the front yet. One thing I like to do occasionally on these things when I come out, the type of overload device that we use is a mechanically actuated overload device. You've got the indicator on the junction box here, the needle. These cork springs are light enough that you can occasionally check to see if your pending overload and your final overload is working properly. Just by coming out here on the bridge, my hand, move your drive over. Get the alarm and shut down. Okay, we know our alarm and our shutdown is working okay. So we're pretty much ready now to gather up our tools and go to the house.